I was enjoying Doreen's introduction so much, I just wanted to sit down and relax and enjoy it even more. It was a very moving and very, very thoughtful introduction, and I want to thank you, Doreen, and your entire team for helping to put this together this evening, so thank you. I also want to acknowledge Marion Ackerman, who is an extraordinary leader, cultural leader, who I've known for some time. She has great courage and great vision, and it's an honor to be part of her program in the smallest way. Thank you, Hilke, for your warm welcome. I had my chance to visit here today for the first time and to see the dynamism of the collection and how you are reinventing the thinking about the collection through the many interventions here. So I want to congratulate you and embolden you to keep going. It's terrific. And I also want to thank, in particular, the American Academy in Berlin, because I wouldn't be here otherwise. In fact, it's a very small world because one of my trustees at the Whitney Museum is the grandson of Heinrich Arnhold. So somehow all things come together. But I'd like to thank you, Ute, for your kind remarks and for the Academy making it possible for me to be here this evening. So I'm going to charge forward. I have lots of pictures, so if you lose tracks of the words, you'll hopefully be able to follow through pictures. I'm a great believer that pictures have power. So I'm going to jump right in here with a brief history of Whitney Biennial, Promise and Protest. And the promise part will give, particularly, I'm so aware of the fact that when you're in a different culture, you don't get a sense of the context in the same way as when you're in your own culture. And so it's important for me to provide that context, and so you'll get quite a background of the Whitney's Biennial before I dive into the meat of the matter. So, yes, please. Is the monitor is it on there? Okay. Yes, feel free to come forward. I won't ask you to answer any questions. If you sit in the front row, it's okay. So off we go. Since its founding in 1932, the purpose of the Whitney Biennial was to showcase the relevance of American art and to serve as a vehicle for the establishment of an American artistic identity at a moment when it was in the shadow of European art. As the only museum of its time solely focused on contemporary American art of the U.S., the Whitney Biennial exhibitions seemed to be authoritative, and accordingly, they generated enormous public interest, outsized press response, and large audiences. Almost from its inception, the Biennial has been a lightning rod, an exhibition that was a barometer of its time and often a contested space. Each Biennial was and is a chapter of an institutional history and arguably a national cultural history, conveying the zeitgeist, the preoccupations, the tastes, and social concerns of America, not only what was included in the exhibition, but what was omitted. The 2024 Biennial, which just opened a few weeks ago, is devoted to notions of the real and is being scrutinized for the art it presents and criticized for what it doesn't present. Each Biennial is, in effect, a chapter in the history of style and the definition of who is an American, the artist, of the artwork, and the role of art, as well as an indicator on trends of art collecting and the art market. And as the Whitney Biennial inexorably occurs every 2 years, it was and continues to be a regular and major source for a large percentage of the museum's acquisitions. Thus, the history of the Whitney Biennial is profoundly inscribed into the very fiber of the Whitney Museum. Tonight, I will offer some thoughts on a number of questions. What were the reasons for creating the Biennial? How has it shifted over its 100-year history? How has it been perceived and received by critics? Why has it been, and why does it continue to be controversial, and why is it relevant today? Speaking of why is it relevant today, this is the question that needs to be asked. As you can see from this chart, there are well over 300 biennials and other periodic multi-year survey exhibitions, triennials, etc. worldwide. Biennials, originally modeled on 19th century world expositions, now exist on every continent. The earliest and best known of which is the Venice Biennale, which just opened recently. As a cursory search of the internet reveals, biennials validate an artist and open opportunities for future museum shows, gallery representation, and sales opportunities. And above all, they serve as a political tool for national promotion. And while the Whitney Biennial was motivated by both forces, its raison d'etre was a belief in the significance and power of American art and artists. To set the stage, today, with the dominance of the United States in all sectors, art being no exception, it is difficult to imagine that the concept of American art did not truly exist at the early part of the 20th century. Indeed, for American artists hoping to garner reputations of any significance, it was a requirement that they study in the great schools of art in Paris, London, and Munich, not New York. In the first decades of the 20th century now, iconic artists such as Edward Hopper and George O'Keeffe, both of whom were in the first Whitney Biennial in 1932, had very limited reputations, careers, opportunities, and markets in the United States, no less than in Europe, where they were completely unknown. Even at present, while Hopper and O'Keeffe are well-recognized figures, there is not a substantial collection of either artist's work anywhere abroad. At present, even early celebrated abstract artists who were embraced by the Whitney, exhibited in the first biennials, and are now well collected and exhibited, are considered earliest 20th century masters, such as Arthur Dove and John Merrin, yet most remain completely unrecognized abroad. And I suspect some of you don't know their names, perhaps. It's interesting because there are some artists who are exceptions, for example, in Germany, such as Marsden Hartley and Lionel Feiniger, in large measure because of their associations with this country. Hartley worked briefly in Berlin from 1912 to 1915, where he painted a very important group of quasi-abstract German officer paintings based on his love interest with the Prussian Lieutenant Karl von Freyberg in Germany. He also befriended Franz Marc, Wassily Kandinsky, and exhibited with Der Blaue Reiter. These paintings were given a magnificent exhibition some of you may have seen at the Neue National Gallery a decade ago. Lionel Feiniger, whose work you see on the right, studied in Hamburg and Berlin and beginning in 1887, and then settled there in 1936, and then eventually went back to the US. He was associated with the Berlin Secession, the Der Blaue Reiter, and the Bauhaus. In fact, many Germans and many Americans consider him to be a German artist. We're actually a little bit getting ahead of our story. So if we start with Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who was born in 1875, she was the heiress of one of the wealthiest families in America. At age 21, she married Harry Payne Whitney, the sportsman and playboy of another Gilded Area family. And traveling in France as a young woman, Gertrude was exposed to and inspired by art and artists, in particular by expressionist sculpture of Auguste Rodin. Unhappy in marriage, Whitney found her identity through making art, as a sculptor working in Beaux-Arts tradition which she pursued throughout her life. As she said, "It never made any difference to Harry, her husband, that I feel as I do about art, and it never will, except as a source of annoyance." In 1907, to her family's great dismay, Mrs. Whitney took the radical step of creating a studio worlds away from uptown Fifth Avenue society in Greenwich Village on MacDougall Alley, where she associated with a downtown crowd of unaffiliated, progressive, bohemian social reformers. This soon became her community, a new independent American art and cultural milieu that did not primarily look to Europe for inspiration. She became the champion of a group of artists, radical realists, of whom a number were socialists, such as John Sloan, who were derogatorily called the Ashcan School painters, as they frequently painted the life of the urban poor in the back streets of New York. Her move to a lowly part of town away from high society was a mark of her individuality and her independence. And she was not afraid to be outspoken in a tradition-bound, class, gender, and race-restricted upper-crust society of New York. Her remark was, "It is so much easier to let others think for us than to think for ourselves," which is a motto that could be very much used today. And it became a statement not only of self-affirmation, but a rallying cry for a new generation of artists. In short order, Mrs. Whitney's personal search for self-realization as a woman, and as an artist became intertwined with the creation of a national art identity. Her studio became a salon for independent artists, and her fortune became the support system for progressive American artists, men and women, via exhibitions, acquisitions, publications, and even living expenses. Accordingly, in 1918, she created what was called the Studio Club as a home, an informal living room for artists, a place that offered studio space, exhibition space, a place for artists to meet, to hang out, and to see one another's art. The Studio Club, which lasted for a decade, was a place for some 300 artists, 40% of whom were women, and this is well before 1928. Established in the spirit of artistic democracy and plurality, there was no orthodoxy that governed the work of the club's members. Anyone who wanted to become a member could become a member. The fee was nominal, and it was usually waived for most of the artists because they couldn't afford to come anyway. There were realists, social realists, expressionists, abstractionists, all of whom shared a belief in creating what was hoped to be a new, original American art language. And above all, there was a belief in the community of artists and their individual and independent voices. This nonconformist spirit was to become a motivating force for the Whitney Museum itself, as well as for the Biennial, which would soon be recognized as its signature exhibition. In many ways, the Whitney Museum was an accidental museum. Mrs. Whitney was first and foremost committed to her career as an artist. By 1929, she had come to the conclusion that the Studio Club had done much of its work creating a network for independent American artists. Accordingly, she offered her entire gift of 400 works of modern art, most of which were acquired to support artists, as well as $1 million to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to establish a contemporary American art galleries. The director, then, a man named Edward Robinson, stated that he had a distrust for the new, which tells you a lot about that time and our time of the present as well, and that they already had a cellar full of those things downstairs. He flatly refused the offer, and this was particularly noteworthy because Mrs. Whitney's father was a member of the Board of Trustees of the Metropolitan Museum. Thus, in 1931, in response to the rejection and in an atmosphere of American pride, as pronounced by the eagle over its new doorway, the Whitney Museum was physically and metaphorically connected to the studio of Mrs. Whitney, which was opened in the heart of downtown artist community. Ever since, with the acknowledgement that truly unconventional art would not necessarily be accepted in its time, which is very much true today, was totally baked into the DNA of the Whitney Museum. The Whitney Museum, unlike the Museum of Modern Art, the Guggenheim Museum, and most modern and contemporary American museums, was one of the only major museums established by an artist rather than a collector. From its inception, the Whitney was known as the Artists' Museum. This strong connection to artists continues to the present, and the Biennial is, in effect, its recommitment to these unshakable bonds. This continuing pledge to artists has been the Whitney's greatest strength, and as you will see, has posed some of its greatest challenges throughout its nearly 100-year history. But let's talk promise before we get to protest. The seeds of the Whitney Biennial were sown in the early days of the Whitney Studio Club, which continued with the first Whitney Biennial of contemporary American painting in 1932. At that time, the biennial alternated between painting and sculpture. You didn't mix them up. From the start, the conception was to present a representative and an inclusive view of art made in the previous 2 years, in the belief that the exhibition could give a comprehensive survey of the most notable characteristics of American painting. The first biennial included 157 artists whose works exhibited diverse stylistic tendencies from as many regions in the U.S. as possible. The paintings The paintings were not hung in the customary salon style with work stacked floor to ceiling, but in a rather spare manner, giving each painting its due. Even though it actually looks a little bit stuffy here, this was considered a little bit radical. And in truly democratic fashion, each artist selected for the biennial chose the work they wanted to present and was involved in its installation. And unlike the prevailing academic exhibitions of the day, there were no juries, no prizes. Artists were treated respectfully. It was not to be a competition among the artists themselves or a horse show with winners and losers. For decades, the curators of the exhibition were not specifically named and celebrated, which is quite radically different today because we know first who curated every show and we don't even know the names of most of the artists in many cases. For decades, the curators were not specifically named before, as is typical today, and the idea was not to detract from the artist and put the curators first. The exhibition was wildly popular, bringing a breath of fresh air to the exclusive, pretentious, and effete shows of the period. The museum's first director, notably a woman, Juliana Force, who served as director for close to 20 years, acknowledged that the word museum has an awesome sound. It frightens and it intimidates on the outside, and it paralyzed thought on the inside. And I would argue that's still true in many museums today. The openness of the Whitney Biennial and the camaraderie it inspired was considered an antidote to this notion of an institutional establishment. The biennial catalog was an expression of the spirit of the boosterism itself, not quite as fancy as the biennial catalogs today. It listed not only the names of the artists, but it gave their personal addresses so that any potential buyer could contact them directly. Of course, most of them didn't have gallery representation. In fact, all the works in themselves were for sale. This custom encouraged the development of a market for contemporary American art, which didn't really exist before that time. And this continued until the 1970s in the catalog, that you could literally call up Edward Hopper and say, I'd like to buy a painting of yours. While current practice at the Whitney is quite the opposite. Today, the museum takes first option on the objects because it is understood that given the heated market attention to artists for selected biennials, in the early days, the public was encouraged to have its first choice. So just to mention a few key exhibitions of the biennial, then gives you a sense of why they were even groundbreaking and important. Well, each previous biennial was in its own manner, a landmark. Here, I wanted to share a selection of images that acknowledge some of the watershed moments. And to a great extent, especially beginning in the 1950s, before the establishment of most worldwide biennials, the Whitney Biennial led the contemporary art world. Artists, scholars, museums, collectors, and galleries. And actually, if I were to replay that chart and kind of show you how many biennials were established previously, you would see it's actually a very small percentage. The great majority of them occurred in the last 20 to 25 years. In 1973, the Whitney did not separate artists between painters and sculptors, as artists had no longer thought of themselves categorically a painter or a sculptor. For the first time, it became an all-media biennial, as the catalog recognized. The consolidation of media also obviates the increasingly shadowy distinction between painting and sculpture, and recognized that a great number of artists were working in multimedia and interdisciplinary manners. Furthermore, while the exhibition utilized every floor of the Whitney's new Marcel Breuer building for the first time, the museum acknowledged that even a show of this size cannot begin to approximate a fair cross-section of creative talents and trends, and would have to focus on new directions. Moreover, this was the last biennial not to specifically identify the curators who organized the show. In 1975, the biennial introduced the general public to the new notion of video art, acknowledging that art produced for the television set could actually be art. The exhibition included work by such pioneers as Juan Downey, Bell Viola, Beryl Corot, all who've investigated the constituent properties of electronic art. And at that time, the Whitney was one of the first museums to specifically appoint a curator of video art. In 1983, although the idea of installation art came into circulation in the 1970s and a number of installation works were included in previous biennials, the 1983 biennial was the first biennial to call it out as a category. The notion of the Gesamtkunstwerk, pioneered by artists such as Kurt Schwitters in the 1920s, and you have the kind of recreation up here in the very galleries here, you get a sense, was being reinvented for the present as it has become an enduring art form in the world of art in general. The 1985 biennial, curated by a team of 6 Whitney curators, most of who became known as curatorial luminaries, was a hallmark for identifying such trends as neo-expressionism, graffiti, conceptual and political art, and in particular a number of artists of the so-called pictures generation, and artists is also associated with a collective called group material. Among them, Barbara Kruger, who has a wonderful piece up here in the collection, Louise Lawler, and Tim Rollins were featured. In Time magazine, the ornery critic Robert Hughes wrote of this fresh and energetic biennial that despite a smattering of mature and serious work, this year's biennial was generally agreed to be the worst in living memory. That was a constant refrain, and even today, in the most current biennial, you have a lot of people who really love it, and there are a handful of people who just think, well, it always makes it very entertaining. The 1993 biennial perhaps was the most controversial and notorious of all biennials, especially because it was based on notions of content and was immediately recognized as the biennial which broke open the doors of the white contemporary art world to artists of color as never before. This extraordinary image by Pat Ward-Williams, What You Lookin' At, was in the front window of the museum, and the title of the director's preface to the catalog was Know Thyself, Know Your Place. These were salvos to the establishment and changed the course of the Whitney museums and the art world irrevocably. More to come on this one. The 2010 biennial, which focused on the images of the body, shaped by physical, spiritual, and social violence and bearing the scars of war, discrimination, and hatred, was shockingly also the first to include more women than men. Performance art, this is a view of the 2012 biennial, performance art had often been an aspect of previous Whitney biennials through adjunct programs. The 2012 biennial foregrounded the status of performance and emphasized the flux and instability of the times by changing aspects of the exhibition throughout the course of the exhibition, as well as devoting an entire floor, the largest floor of the museum, just for continuing performances. So basically, turning the museum into a performance space. This exhibition was, interestingly enough, lauded for being one of the best biennials in memory in the New York Times, which noted it as a new and exhilarating species of exhibition and an emerging curatorial form. Now, just as the exhibitions are milestones during the several months they are on view, and while many of the exhibitions themselves have enduring impact, the works that are acquired for the collection extend that influence in perpetuity. And many biennial acquisitions are artists' first museum acquisition for any museum, and a majority are the Whitney's first purchase of an artist's work. And I'm just going to run through some examples really quickly. Some of these names will be well known to you, others will be probably less known. But Arshile Gorky, for example, this is the first painting ever acquired by any museum. Jacob Lawrence, this was part of an amazing series of works that Jacob Lawrence did and was very early supported on by the Whitney. Stuart Davis, the most important American cubist of his time, is an artist we collect in depth. Louise Bourgeois, we started collecting her work back in the 1930s, but this is a piece that was actually acquired in 1956. And now we actually have 32 works in the collection, a majority of which were collected at a time long before anybody had ever heard of her name. Joseph Cornell in 1956. Philip Guston in 1956. Edward Hopper, Women in the Sun, 1966, who was given his first one-man exhibition through the Whitney's predecessor through the Studio Club in the 1920s. Agnes Martin in 1963. Donald Judd. James Rosenquist. Glenn Ligon, we have the largest holdings of Glenn Ligon's work of any museum. David Hammons, very major work by David. Yayoi Kusama, who was first shown in the Whitney Museum in the late 1950s when she was living downstairs from Donald Judd. Daniel Joseph Martinez, very relevant work here called Divine Violence, which is a typology of every organization in the world that uses violence as aggression to fulfill its political ideology. Nicole Eisenman, one of the great protesters against the Whitney, whose work we acquired as part of it. Jennifer Packer, extraordinary painting of hers, and we presented one of her first Surrey shows. And this work, which by an indigenous artist, Rebecca Belmore, which is a work acquired jointly with the National Gallery in Canada. And before I get to the protests, I just want to mention one other area, and that is the notion of expanding the site. It's the idea that all of our museums cannot contain the culture that that artists continue to challenge us with. It's interesting because in 1966, the Whitney built its new iconic building designed by the Hungarian-born Bauhaus-trained Marcel Breuer. Indeed, it was kind of a curious choice for a museum devoted to American art, but that's another story. It was created not just to house its growing collection, both in numbers and size of works, but to accommodate large-scale exhibitions, most notably the Biennial. By the time it was realized, it was already too small for the growing ambitions of the conceptions of contemporary art, and in response, the curators, led by artists, reconsidered the idea of the site, and consequently the idea of the museum as a container. How many of you knew that the Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson was in the 1970 Biennial? Now, of course, we had nothing to do with its creation, but the curators felt it was important to acknowledge the radicality of earthworks that were being made, and that the only way to do that was to extend the idea that the Biennial didn't actually have to be in the building and didn't actually have to have been created in any way for the museum. This other piece, which is a little hard to see, it's called To Encircle Baseplate and was done in 1970, which was also designated as a biennial installation, was one of the first ever Richard Serra outdoor installations. So very important work in his career, who just passed away. Artists such as German-based American artist Julia Scher are committed to exposing and infiltrating the systems and structure of a museum, now commonly called institutional critique. She created works that stretch traditional understanding and functions of museums. Security by Julia, I love that, that's Julia right there, mocks the surveillance culture of museums and the ascendancy of the surveillance state. Now remember, this is in 1989, and she was fully into this. These projects decentered the artworks themselves, shifting the focus from the objects on view in the galleries to the viewers and the security staff and the apparatus of the museum. I always love this one, the Charlie Ray that he did for the 1993 Biennial subversively created a life-size archetypal toy version of an American fire truck that was parked in front of the museum. And while it brought delight to many people, it also set off alarms in some people's minds, suggesting, as many an artist before, that the museum was on fire, both literally and metaphorically. Works such as these thrust museum exhibitions onto the streets and into the public realm. Artist Franco Mondini Ruiz made use of what is now commonly termed as relational aesthetics. That is, art that deals with human relations and interactions and messes with the reality of social context. His work for the 2000 Biennial consisted of setting up a table in front of the museum where he sold Chicano kitsch and works by some of the artists he particularly selected. As New York Times critic Roberta Smith wrote, his work questions notions of preciousness and art market exclusivity. Sculptor Paul McCarthy derisively turned the Whitney's building into a pedestal for a gigantic inflatable sculpture, while the Austrian-born, American-based installation artist Erwin Redl electronically painted and dissolved the exterior of the brutalist Breuer building. Both works subversively showcase the artwork to all artists, not simply those willing to pay the price of admission. And then there was, in 2002, the Whitney insinuated itself into the confines of sacred Central Park, and I mean sacred. Nobody does things in Central Park. It's the only wild thing, or the only tame wild thing in New York. And we commissioned works at the time from Kusama and the artist Keith Edemeyer, who complicated the ideas of monuments and effectively turned New York City into a large-scale museum, which in many ways set the stage for Christo and Jean-Claude's The Gates that happened in 2005, because it was the first time that the Central Park allowed art into its confines. And while the new Whitney downtown has much more outdoor and indoor and outdoor space in its Renzo Piano building, opened in 2015, the Whitney itself, from its inception, has amplified the notion of museum as container through expanded external spaces. Furthermore, many artists, through public and community participation that revision the museum not only simply as an edifice, but as a cultural agent that participates in societal flux. The billboard by Puppies Puppies, great name, also represented in the Venice Biennale that just opened, and their performance work on the exterior staircase are such examples. And it was great because you could look at the Statue of Liberty on the staircase of the museum, and you could look over your shoulder and you could see the actual the Statue of Liberty. Other artists continue to subvert and challenge the institution. And one such example of the many artists working in this genre is Colleen Smith, an extraordinary young artist who, in the face of violence on black people, she literally took her art from the museum's lobby to the streets. In the Wake, the title of which comes from the author Christina Sharp's book, In the Wake on Blackness and Being, offered Smith a performative pathway through black people's collective reckoning with state-sanctioned violence toward a defiance, a resistance, and a public and visible assertion of love. And I'm sorry, this was supposed to be a little video that I could play you, but somehow it ain't playing, so you'll have to go look it up on the Whitney website. This is what everybody's always waiting for, protest. We'll start here. Since its founding, Whitney has been associated with protests, often but not always connected with the biennial. The recent screenshot shown here is a sign of this perennial popular association. And I just took this a couple of weeks ago. The first thing that comes up is, why is the Whitney associated with protest? It's like the biennial advertising campaign represented by the poster on the right, produced some 20 years ago, was itself tacit recognition that the biennial was known for stirring up controversy, but naively and lightheartedly capitalized on what has been increasingly seen as a serious, consequential societal struggle being effectuated in cultural institutions here in Germany as well as it is all over the world. The Whitney, with its commitment to living artists, has always been devoted to the art of the present. Therefore, by addressing art in real time, the museum presents rather unfiltered, raw, and often radical works that attend to key critical, aesthetic, social, and political issues of the time. And this makes the Whitney real and relevant, but it also made it very vulnerable. As one Whitney trustee said to me not long ago regarding a protest at the museum, if we truly believe that the Whitney Museum should be part of the conversation, we must realize that it means we do not always get to choose the conversation. As the director of the museum, my role increasingly entailed making the board and staff comfortable with discomfort, which Doreen was alluding to, and understanding that controversy was a necessary and a distinctive attribute of the Whitney's DNA. One of the earliest protests on record against the Whitney, and I'm not going to go through every one because we would be here for probably a month, but just to give you a sense that this didn't start recently, was the biennial being protested by a group called the 10 in 1935. This group of modernist, expressionist painters originally formed in a rather disorganized fashion, as protesters sometimes are. As one can see from the catalog on the left, there are only 9 artists and named, even though there are actually 10, in objection to rather vaguely defined academic tendencies in American art. Indeed, this group and their protest probably would have been forgotten except for 2 factors. First, it included several individuals who would become known for changing the course of mid-century modern art. Adolf Gottlieb, Mark Rothko, and this is before he changed his name, as you can see, it's Rothkowitz, John Graham, and Ilya Bolotowski. Second, in 1938, 3 days after the inauguration of the Whitney 1938 annual, the group adopted the catchy moniker, the 10 Whitney dissenters. Before that, they were just the 10. But they realized that if they could identify the museum as the target of their complaint, they would be able to create a cause célèbre. In effect, much like the present, the museum was as much instrumentalized as a means to amplify messages and recognition of the artists themselves as the target of the critique. The 10 dissenters rejected that contemporary American art was dogmatically defined as representational art preoccupied with local color, which condemns the influence of Cubist and abstractionist innovators. They thought that American art, as then defined by the Whitney, was provincial and was only contemporary simply in a chronological sense. Furthermore, they identified contemporary representational painters as being stuck in the European past with their imitations of masters such as Titian, Bruegel, and Degas. And these were the only reproductions that I could find of these paintings, which gives you a sense of the currency of them today, because these were the ones from the original catalog. Take a step here. The battle between abstractionists and figurative artists in the contemporary American art world played out for decades in the Whitney Biennial. From 1940 until 1957, the powerful and dominant critic Clement Greenberg, who was the most vociferous proponent of abstract formalist art, became known as the greatest champion of abstract expressionism. He ruled the roost successively in the pages of periodicals such as the Partisan Review, The Nation, and Commentary. And in the 1940s, the Whitney, remaining true to its democratic mission as the enduring presence the Whitney Eagle symbolizes, attempted to balance abstract and figurative approaches, a position that was seen by Greenberg and others as regressive. Greenberg wrote in The Nation, "This year's Whitney Annual is no worse than last year's, which amounts to almost an improvement. Of course, the fault lies chiefly with the artists themselves, a mere considerable part of the blame that one used to think is assignable to those who run the place," meaning the curators, the directors, and the staff. Nevertheless, he blames the curators with their lack of strong-mindedness, of serious bias, of any intense and constant preoccupation with the tasks of modern art. And despite the continued cleavage between representational and abstract art as exemplified here, it was clear, as the New York Times wrote, there seems to be little doubt it by now, the Whitney has gone modern to stay. This split turned a corner in protest associated with the 1959 Whitney Annual when 22 artists, among them Edward Hopper, Jacob Lawrence, and Jack Levine, long associated with the Whitney, politely wrote a letter of protest. "We are the artist friends of the Whitney who are deeply disturbed by the role of museums in contemporary art scene." In this context, it's difficult not to see Hopper's painting on the left as a commentary both on the artistic and social state of affairs as he experienced them at the height of the Cold War. This group of painters go so far as to rather abjectly categorize the works according to the degree of abstraction in the show. There were 102 non-objective paintings, 17 abstract and semi-abstract, and there were only 9 paintings in which the image had not receded or disappeared. It is not hard to imagine that for these artists, seeing radical paintings by artists like Jasper Johns, Joan Mitchell, and Ellsworth Kelly must have been disconcerting, as they saw their style and their subjects being eclipsed by the incoming generation. With the gathering storms of protest in the late 50s, the politesse of the 22 realists and their arguments about realism fell on deaf ears, and the museum, in effect, refuted their specific interpretation of realism. Anger at the political and social situations in the 1960s and 70s stimulated protests in general throughout the United States and internationally, to state the obvious. The Whitney, along with many museums, became sites for political art. The Whitney itself was the target of numerous criticisms and protests from all quarters. Women Artists in Revolution, who demanded the greater representation in the biennials, the Art Workers Coalition, who I once worked for, who advocated for reform of museum practices, as well as to close museum exhibitions in response to the Vietnam War. The Black Emergency Coalition, who demanded the hiring of black curators and a firm commitment to collecting works by black artists. All of these critiques worked their ways into the biennials of the next 2 decades. Many of these protests were chronicled in an exhibition organized by the Whitney in 2017, An Incomplete History of Protest. I always thought it was a great title because it suggests that it's an ongoing thing, and it always will be. And this show that was, I would say, in and of itself, was part of a reckoning process for the museum. In 1970, for example, the ad hoc Women's Art Committee, which included the critic Lucy Lepard and artist Faith Rengold, led a protest against the overwhelmingly male 1970 White Biennial. The committee staged artist demonstrations and sit-ins during the 2.5 months leading up to the exhibitions, Protesters went so far as to place tampons and uncooked eggs bearing the 50% message, demanding that half of the artists be females and that half of those women be black. Let's see. An incomplete history of protest included a small but searing work called Hate is Sin by Faith Reingold, which was recently acquired by the museum and I think also was part of that reckoning process. The work, which related to the Black Emergency Coalition's protest of 1971, attests to the museum's complicity in reinforcing the inequality of art and culture in the U.S. The work reads as follows. The first time I was called a nigger was at the Whitney Museum in New York. I was passing out flyers outside the museum about the Whitney's discrimination against black artists when a white man told his daughter, "Don't go near that nigger." That was 39 years ago in 1968. Slavery is hate. Hate is a sin. These issues were far from addressed at the time and have been cause for continued reflection, redress, and protest up to the present at the Whitney and at so many other museums, and rightfully so. The 1980s, the Whitney was seen to be a close ally of the market over the individualistic, artistic, and political interests of the artists. The curators responded to past criticisms of these sprawling shows that lacked any point of view and took on board that with an estimated 200,000 artists working in the U.S., it was impossible to try to present a survey. The 1987 biennial was considerably smaller and more focused, and many people thought more beautiful, with a more rigorous selection and a more exclusive group of artists, but that was indeed what led to that criticism. On this occasion, the exhibition was specifically rebuked for representing the majority of artists from New York City, 50% of the artists from only a handful of galleries. And as the Burlington magazine wrote, the Whitney Biennial again this year, as in years past, promiscuously displays what is thought to be fashionable. And the New York Times remarked, nearly all of the painters and sculptors chosen for the show have made their mark in the commercial gallery world in the last 2 years. 1987 also saw an anonymous group of feminist artists, the Guerrilla Girls, founded in 1985, decrying the outrageous sexism and a deplorable record of museums regarding the collecting and exhibiting and critique of New York museums, pointing out that in 1987, the Whitney Biennial only included, shamefully, 18 women out of the 72 invited artists. The Guerrilla Girls proposed a counter-exhibition. As they wrote, they expected us to do a show of what we thought should be in the biennial. Instead, we decided to do an exhibition of information and analysis, exposing the museum's pathetic and worsening record on women and artists of color. Back to the 1993 biennial for a little bit here. And this is a work, and actually one of the most, I would say, both of these works were both incredibly radical and actually works that were major upsets in the press. And the one on the left is the Daniel Martinez Study for Museum Tags and Fred Wilson Guarded View, and both of these being very specifically the tags related to the tags that you wear when you came into a museum. And the guards, and you see basically they are mannequins who are black mannequins wearing anonymous guard uniforms, and that sense of being totally dismissed and disappeared, and the idea of the radicality of the museum. And it was interesting. It took a while for the museum to catch up. And I have to say, the director at the time, a man named David Ross, declared that the museum was a space for the contestation of values. And he acknowledged the DNA of the Whitney all along, that the act of questioning is an aggressive act, and that questions the nature of control. And he said that that is something that the Whitney must participate in if it was truly to be part of the Whitney. And the 1993 biennial took these criticisms to heart, and a team of curators that included the Whitney's first full-time black curator, Thelma Golden, turned the Whitney, the New York, and arguably the Western art world upside down. The 1993 biennial, produced during the height of the culture wars in America, was the most disparaged of all biennials up until that time. This exhibition, the most diverse exhibition in the Whitney's history, boldly addressed questions of gender, identity, and power. As one writer remarked, the margins have become dominant. And an unsympathetic, retrograde review by the chief critic of the New York Times read, And I'll never forget it. I remember the day in the morning I read the show, and this was before I was director. I was a curator at the time. I hate the show. That was the opening line. I imagine many have left the biennial, as I have, battered by condescension. The show implies that anyone who disagrees with what is on view is morally suspect. And he dug in even further when he wrote that it represents the diversity of American art, unless you happen to be a white male painter. Unbelievable. While decried by some, the 1993 biennial was a clarion call. There was no going back. And as a dueling critic for the New York Times wrote, Roberta Smith, this is an inclusive biennial that emphatically reflects the country's diversity by including unsustainably large numbers of non-white artists, artists whose work is openly gay, and women. Moving right along, the 2017 biennial. With the impending US presidential election that brought Donald Trump to office, the atmosphere was replete with ominous overtones. Indeed, the curators of the biennial anticipated a controversial and challenging exhibition. No surprise. And as one of the curators remarked, every time we enter a studio, issues of inequality or violence or racism were being brought up by the artists without our even prompting. And works by many of the artists were deeply disturbing, provocative, and challenging for visitors. Occupy Museums, a collective who saw a direct connection between the corruption of high finance and the corruption of high culture, produced a work that critiqued a wealthy trustee of a sister institution, and others who, as the makers contended, caused artists to be perennially in a cycle of debt. Henry Taylor painted this incredibly searing portrait of Philandro Castile that depicts the instant of the brutal murder of a 32-year-old black man by the police. And William Popel created a room-size installation that consisted of 688 slices of bologna nailed to the walls, each with a small black and white portrait, questionably of people thought to be Jewish, the numbers of which were purportedly equal in proportion to the Jewish population of Philadelphia. Popel said, any counting, and his point was actually critical, any counting is baloney. This work was early on thought by the curators and the critics to be the most challenging, complex piece in the biennial. Yet, while all of these projects angered some audiences, the furor was eclipsed by the rage and the recurring protests caused by painter Dana Schutz's portrayal of the bludgeoned face of teenager Emmett Till, who was tortured and lynched in 1955 for being accused of offending a white woman. Artist Hannah Black at the time summed up the attitude of many, not all, because it was a very divided community, both black and white. In brief, the painting should not be acceptable to anyone who cares or pretends to care about black people, because it is not acceptable for a white person to transmute black suffering into profit and fun, though the practice has been normalized for some time. Although Schutz's intentions may be to present white shame, the subject matter is not Schutz's. White free speech and white creative freedom have been founded on the constraints of others and are not natural rights. The painting must go. That is, should be destroyed and not entered into the market or a museum. The painting wasn't destroyed or removed, nor did it enter a market or the collection. The Whitney kept the painting on view throughout the exhibition, which was not installed as a monographic room devoted by Schutz, but in the context of a group of politically engaged works by diverse artists. Protesters were permitted to keep vigil in the museum throughout, and they did, and the Whitney hosted open forums that were very, very heated, and I thought really productive in many ways. The work also became a prime topic in articles in the editorial pages of the New York Times and national press. While the presence was undoubtedly hurtful to many, it did open the topic for conversation, as Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till, had hoped, when she allowed the originally photographed image to be published, so, as she said, let people see what they did to my boy. The 2019 biennial was likely the most contentious exhibition ever presented, and not because of the artwork in the show itself, but due to the context in which it was organized. By late 2018, protests in the broad cultural sector began to mount in response to the polarizing forces of the Trump administration and the increasing sense of helplessness on the left. especially due to the anti-immigrant focus on building a wall between the United States and Mexico. When it was learned that a Whitney trustee owned a company that produced tear gas being used against immigrants on the border, more than 100 Whitney staff signed an open letter to the museum administration and board requesting that the museum ask for the trustee's resignation, which the board chose not to do. Subsequently, a letter was posted by 120 critics, scholars, and theorists demanding the trustee's resignation and encouraging artists of the 2019 biennial not to participate in the exhibition, which was to open that spring. A large number of the artists in the exhibition signed the petition, and in the months leading up to the biennial opening, that weekly demonstrations were held in the museum as well as in front of the museum, and we did not in any way interfere with those demonstrations. The demonstrations were organized by the collective called Decolonize This Place, and they called for the Whitney's accountability with regards to colonization, erasure, and systemic oppression. One of the artists refused to be included, and a handful chose to have their works removed some weeks after the show was to have opened. The Whitney walked a fine line throughout these tense and incredibly stressful months, trying to balance artists' rights to protest and the museum's need to support itself through private philanthropy. The Whitney was bold in presenting the video Triple Chaser in protest of the trustee and the use of the tear gas, and by the artist group Forensic Architecture, which tracked the spread of tear gas on the Mexican border. And it also did not shut down the protests inside the museum, and it respectfully treated the artists who withdrew and even acquired some of their works, including by artists who drove the protests, such as by Nicole Eisenman's procession. The 2019 biennial, which became known as the Tear Gas Biennial, pointed to an intractable impasse in capitalist society regarding private support of culture, as exemplified by the Whitney, which, like most American museum, only receives minor government support. In the case of the Whitney, less than 1% of its annual budget comes from the government. One writer, Sebastian Smee, for the Washington Post, acknowledged his respect for the protesters. And I think, as he said well, the idea of moral purity is a fantasy. The underlying tension here is obvious. America's greatest cultural institutions were built and sustained by extremes of corporate wealth. Capitalism has always sought to mitigate its worst excesses by recourse to moral money laundering. Or, as the courageous Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation, said, "We have lost our ability to understand nuance." While I am a believer in the need to dismantle some of the systems and structures that represent a kind of white hegemony, I think it would be a grave mistake to destroy a cultural ecosystem that needs reform and not destruction. Epilogue. To end with a story. In 1985, the activist artist David Wojnarowicz was included in the so-called East Village Graffiti Whitney Biennial. It was the fulfillment of a dream he had long aspired to achieve. And yet, it was a success he despised once he attained it. As his biographer, Cynthia Carr, wrote, "I remember running into him on the street. When I congratulated him, he had such a look of distress on his face. He told me he just hated the art world." Wojnarowicz later wrote, "The major museums around the country are just as guilty of selective cultural support and denial as the government with regards to the AIDS epidemic. The artist, in effect, recognized fundamentally conflicted role inherent to museums of contemporary art. They are, on one hand, represent the establishment, and on the other hand, they are the advocates for outsiders, rebels, revolutionaries who reject the boundaries of good taste, the definitions of art itself, and society as currently constituted. Indeed, when Wojnarowicz's post-mortem retrospective was presented in 2018, protesters continued to carry on in his spirit, which I think is something he really would have admired. These contradictions raise foundational questions for the purposes and the very existence of contemporary art museums. Nevertheless, for contemporary art museums to flourish, They will always be caught in the middle, protested on the right and on the left. Contemporary art museums, I believe, must continue to be sites for discussion, debate, and protest. Understandably, museums have been instrumentalized for a particular political ends. This will always be the case. But they must be places, and this is something that Doreen echoed in her opening remarks, must be places where nuanced, contradictory, ambiguous, layered, nonlinear, visual art that is open to interpretation can exist, and where artists can utilize strategies that are elliptical, paradoxical, irreconcilable, evasive, and offensive. Great art is more often than not interrogative, not declarative. What we must recognize is that artists in contemporary museums will and should take social, aesthetic, and political positions. Each generation must stand up for what it believes. While it is the contemporary museum's mission to present that work, and I think of the Whitney in particular and the Biennial as a lightning rod, it is, in my opinion, for the artists to make the art and to take the positions. Thank you very much.